Hey everyone, this is Mike from the Comic Book Trove, back today with another video, and today I'm going to be taking a look at a ranking of my top 5 favourite X-Men Omnibuses in my collection. And now doing a list like this is always quite difficult, especially when limiting myself to just 5 picks. In the past I've done a few top 10s, but I've decided to make it even harder on myself today by just going for 5. So I've had to think about it, looked through my books, and these are ultimately the ones I've settled on as being what I consider to be the 5 best slash my 5 favourite X-Men omnibuses. Now, I will just clarify that these are only out of the X-Men books that I own, so I don't own every X-Men omnibus. These are just from the ones in my collection, and these are just purely X-Men books as well, so no other X-related titles. That means no New Mutants, no X-Factor or anything like that, strictly just X-Men. So without any further ado, let's dive in and I'll showcase the 5 books that I've picked out, talk a little bit about them and why I like them so much, so stick around. Okay then, so let's take a look at these 5 books. Now, I will just say these aren't going to be in a specific order, going from 5 to 1 or 1 to 5, etc. I'm just going to kind of look at them as I've piled them up here. But we're going to start things off by taking a look at the Uncanny X-Men Omnibus Volume 2. Now, for anybody who's seen my top 10 Marvel Omnibus video that I did not too long ago, probably won't be much of a surprise that this appears on here as well, because it was on that list too. This is just really classic stuff. I don't know what to say. It's collecting the final parts of Chris Claremont's legendary collaboration with John Byrne, which produced some of the all-time great X-Men comics in my opinion. And this book starts off right kind of in the middle of the Dark Phoenix saga, which again, you know, really one of the most iconic X-Men stories of all time, one of my favourites anyway. Just as that story is kind of kicking into high gear here, we jump right into it with this omnibus. The artwork by John Byrne and the inking by Terry Austin, I always thought that was really just one of the all-time great artistic collaborations. And the artwork here is really some of my favourite ever in all of comics, which is, you know, I know that's quite high praise, but I do believe it. It's really, really nice, easy on the eye. Every time I see it, it just looks as great as it did the previous time. It never loses its appeal, its shine to me. But yeah, as iconic as this story obviously is, Dark Phoenix, you know, there's other great stuff in this book as well beyond that. So there's also the Days of Future Past story. The final issue of John Byrne's run, issue 143, is a really kind of fun, little bit creepy issue with Kitty Pryde taking on the kind of alien creature that invades the X-Mansion whilst all the other members of the team are away. So that's a pretty intense but interesting story, like that one. And then, you know, we get the departure of John Byrne beyond that and the return of Dave Cockrum. He came back to the book as for a second stint on it, having of course been the original artist of this Uncanny era when the book started again, following Giant Size X-Men issue 1. Yeah, so we move into those issues where we see some other cool stories featuring appearances by Doctor Doom. There's a good story where Storm kind of loses control of her power and they tease the idea of a Dark Storm in a similar kind of way as Dark Phoenix. Very cool. Probably should give a spoiler warning. I'm not really talking about any of this in any detail. I'm certainly only going to really flick through these books and talk briefly about some key points, but just in case, I will just give a spoiler warning before I take a look at anything else. And there's also a really fun story at the end of this book as well, with Kitty Pryde telling a kind of fairy tale story to the young Illyana Rasputin, where all the members of the team are kind of cast into the role of fantasy versions of their characters in a sort of medieval setting. It's really quite funny, quite sweet in a way, and one of the more memorable stories in the book for me, to be honest. I really do enjoy it. But yeah, so all in all, really cool classic stuff, well worth checking out if you've never gone back to take a look at this sort of classic Claremont era X-Men. Well worth doing. Speaking of which, I'm going to segue from Volume 2 straight into Uncanny X-Men Volume 3. As much as I love the material in Volume 2, and as much as I really enjoy that Claremont and Byrne collaboration, I do think that some of the stuff in here is arguably even better than that stuff, which is really saying something. But there's some really great stuff in this book, honestly. It's just full of kind of classic stories. I mean, the one that stands out to me, perhaps more so than the others, in fact, no, a few of them stand out, but certainly one of the standout stories in here is the Brood Saga, which is the first appearance of the alien creatures, long-time X-Men antagonists known as the Brood. Great kind of sci-fi horror story, great concept with those creatures. I mean, they're, I think, quite heavily based on the alien xenomorphs from the Alien series, They're certainly quite similar to those in a way, but you know, different enough to be their own thing, rather than some straight rip-off. I'm not saying that's what they are, but that's certainly what they reminded me of when I first read the story years ago. But very memorable stuff, quite dark. I'd say at this point, you know, during the issues we're seeing here is really where the X-Men series started to get a little bit darker in tone, which is not to say there weren't any issues that were quite dark or serious before this. But with things like the Brood Saga, which I've already mentioned, the story here with Dracula, of course the graphic novel God Loves, Man Kills, that's in here. That's pretty grim. Won't spoil it too much, but it was a key inspiration for the X-Men 2 movie many years ago now. Yeah, that's pretty good. There's also the story which provides the origin for Illyana Rasputin becoming magic. And that's a pretty depressing story in a way. I mean, I do like it. It's one of my favourite X-Men related stories, but a bit of a depressing read, you know, quite grim stuff. But here we've seen some pages from the Brood Saga. Really good stuff with Wolverine kind of trying to escape their planet, trying to find and save the other X-Men. Really is a very eventful story. We see Carol Danvers here put into a new role. She takes on this this identity, I think binary, I think she's known as at this point in time. From memory anyway, that's what I seem to remember it being. Has been a while since I read this stuff, admittedly, but yeah, pretty sure that's right. And yeah, all in all, just really great stuff in this book, you know. Here we are with God Loves, Man Kills, you know. Really one of the all-time great X-Men stories. I mean, that's something you're going to hear me say probably quite a bit throughout here as I look through these different books. But, you know, I am an unapologetically big X-Men fan. And with this being some of my favourite X-Men books, naturally, I'm going to be throwing a lot of praise at this stuff. So, yeah, it's to be expected. Of course, the first Wolverine miniseries, that's in here. Seen pages here from it, written by Claremont, artwork by Frank Miller. Story in which Wolverine goes to Japan and gets caught up in an adventure there. And I like the way how it ultimately links back into the main Uncanny X-Men series as well. Yeah, and into this wedding storyline. And then right at the end here, so we see Rogue joining the team as well. Kind of officially moving over into the X-Men, having previously been a villain with the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. We start to see the beginning of her association with the X-Men as of the end of this book. And that's not to even mention the involvement of Paul Smith as the artist during some of the issues in here as well, which I didn't really showcase, but he is an X-Men artist well worth mentioning. We'll move on from that, jump a little bit ahead in X-Men history to the first X-Men crossover event. The first of what would turn out to be many more, of course. But this is the Mutant Massacre Omnibus. And as the back of the book promises here, it was the first X-Men event and still the most brutal. And I do think to a large extent that is true. You know, this was kind of a no pulled punches kind of story. I think this may have caught a few people off guard with just how brutal it kind of was at the time. I mean, what I like about this story is how it genuinely had lasting consequences and kind of changed the direction of this series for really the rest of Chris Claremont's entire run beyond this point. Without spoiling too much, the concept of the story being that there's this group of mutant hunters / mutant killers who set their sights on taking out the Morlocks, who were a group of mutants living in the sewers under New York City at this time. The X-Men get caught up in it, X-Factor get caught up in it, the New Mutants briefly get caught up in it. And yeah, a lot of violence ensues, and a lot of members of the team, the X-Men, do end up paying a bit of a price for their involvement in here. They don't all come out of it, you know, all well and good. You know, there are some serious injuries, some serious repercussions from their involvement in this storyline. And it means that we lose some key members of the team for quite a while after this. So you see, for example, Kitty Pryde, Nightcrawler, Colossus, all end up being sidelined as a result of what happens in here, and remain kind of sidelined for a while. You know, they don't jump right back into the team. They are absent, and ultimately some of those members end up doing their own thing and not really coming back to the X-Men for quite a long time after this. But this particular omnibus, it collects the full Mutant Massacre storyline, all the crossovers and tie-ins, and then it moves slightly beyond it as well. So there is quite a bit of Mutant Massacre Aftermath, really, collected in this book before it goes into the next omnibus in the chronology. If you're just reading this series in omnibus format, you'd go from this straight into Fall of the Mutants. But yeah, this is a really good storyline. It came at a time where the concept of a big crossover event was brand new, and I think it still holds as being quite memorable for that reason. Before the events kind of got diluted down into becoming more of a mandatory thing that was just kind of expected every year or so, or even more frequently than that. That was a storyline, an event which told a very meaningful story. And like I say, it had a big impact on the series for the remainder of Claremont's run. But speaking of the end of Claremont's run, we get his final issues collected in this book. This is the X-Men by Chris Claremont and Jim Lee, Omnibus Volume 2. And the reason I've kind of included this, again, this was a book that appeared in my top Marvel omnibuses in general. But it's just that kind of undeniable cool factor, I suppose you could call it, with the Jim Lee artwork. Now, I am a Jim Lee fan, so of course that's going to influence my opinion on this. If you are not a Jim Lee fan, I'm sure you probably wouldn't like this book quite as much. But even so, I don't regard this as being the very best kind of X-Men artwork or the best Jim Lee artwork or anything like that. It's just that it's got an undeniable kind of style to it. That kind of 90s factor is on full show here, and it's something I do have a bit of a soft spot for, at least in some cases. But the story as well, it's still Claremont writing it, and even towards the very end of his run, when he'd been writing this book for going on 17 years by the time it was all said and done, he was still bringing some great storytelling to it. And what you start to get in here is the kind of the build-up to the whole kind of X-Men team reuniting when they've been separate for quite a long time up to this point. You'd had the original X-Men team had formed X-Factor, but finally, as a result of things that happen in here, everybody kind of comes back together again, and you get the launch of that adjectiveless X-Men series, that famous X-Men issue #1 with all the multiple covers by Jim Lee, best-selling comic of all time, all that going on within the pages of this omnibus. And it is genuinely exciting. You get some great stories that lead up to the launch of that series as the team is brought back together by the events of the stories. And like I say, undeniably, fundamentally, the artwork by Jim Lee is just, for the most part, really nice. You also see a lot of artwork by Whilce Portacio in here, which you have to mention as well. I will say, and apologies to any Whilce Portacio fans, but his artwork is not as good to me as Jim Lee's is. I don't like it as much. Don't hate it or anything like that, but it doesn't quite do it for me in the same way. But yeah, just a really fun book, and a book that had its influence at the time. Certainly ended up impacting the X-Men animated series. These Jim Lee character designs heavily influenced the designs in that cartoon show. And yeah, it's just an era of X-Men that I think definitely has its place in X-Men history, and is something that is well worth checking out. Again, as all these books are, really. They wouldn't be on this list if I didn't recommend them, so something that's worth reading if you're interested in this era of comics in general, and of course, if you are looking at reading any X-Men stories that you're yet to get to. But that's going to bring us on to the fifth and final book here, the most recent material, and this is the New X-Men by Grant Morrison Omnibus. And this is something that's really quite different. All that stuff before this, that was all part of Chris Claremont's run. I mean, Claremont's run on X-Men is legendary. It is, in my opinion, the definitive X-Men run. I think it would be hard to argue against that. But if there's going to be one that comes close, I would say it's probably has to be this run by Grant Morrison. And what's really great about this book and this run is that what Morrison did, in my opinion, is really revitalise this book when it had spent a few years where the X-Men series had really kind of lost its focus and became just kind of muddled in big crossover event after crossover event during the mid to late 90s, and you had things like, Onslaught, stories like that just really weren't that great, and it just seemed like the purpose of the X-Men team and the series was just to get caught up in big kind of summer blockbuster events without necessarily telling really great stories. And I'm not saying there aren't any great stories from the mid to late 90s era of X-Men, but I think that this came along and Morrison really kind of refocused this series, brought some cool ideas back to it, and gave it a bit of a new purpose. And you get things like the idea of mutants having secondary mutations. Early on in this series, Professor X makes the decision to go public with the identity of the team and the school, and come out really with the truth of what their identity is and what their purpose is there in terms of training and looking after new mutants, or young mutants, I should say. Emma Frost is introduced into the team for the first time. She's a wild card member of the team. Interesting to see how that influences the dynamic between the other team members. And just a really interesting book to read. It is really quite different to anything that came before, I would say, in the X-Men, and probably different to anything that's come since. Morrison is a writer who writes in a particular way, often deals with this kind of complex, kind of high concept ideas. I wouldn't say that this is the most difficult read, or anything like that. I don't want to put anybody off and say that this is really complicated, you're going to have to think hard about it. It's not really the case, but certainly there are really cool ideas presented here, which I found to be very interesting as I read through this book the first time that I did so. And for that reason, it is something that I recommend. I will say that the artwork is a little bit hit and miss. There's quite a few different artists who worked on this run during this time with Morrison, and not everybody is, in my opinion, not all the artwork is as good as some of the other styles. It's not, unfortunately, not a case where you just get one artist and one writer working together. I tend to think that usually works best when you have a fairly high kind of high rate of artists kind of switching and coming and going. Sometimes the kind of visual continuity does kind of suffer for that. I do feel that is the case a bit with this series, but never so much that it was, to its detriment in any significant way, or I thought that it was ruining things for me. No. It is still something, of course, that I highly recommend, again, because it's on this list. So, yeah, take that as you will. If you haven't read this run before, I do recommend you do so. I believe a reprint of this omnibus is coming. I had to think for a moment there if it's already out, but I think it's coming in 2023. Apologies if I'm mistaken by that. It is getting to a point with Marvel Omnibuses now where I am losing track a little bit, just because so many of them are being announced, and then you get delays with most of them, and it does become a little difficult, for me at least, to try and remember when some of these books are released. But anyway, it is something that hopefully, if it isn't already, will be available again soon, and definitely worth picking up if you're interested in any way in either works by Morrison or looking at something that I would describe as maybe a bit more of a modern take on X-Men, if for whatever reason you don't want to go back further and look at the Claremont stuff, although of course I highly recommend you do. But that will end that for now then. So that's my 5 picks for a top X-Men omnibuses in my collection. Hopefully something that was interesting to look through and listen to. Maybe something you found interesting or insightful in some way. Let me know if you agree with any of my picks, disagree with some, and if so, which other books would you maybe put in a list of your own. But otherwise, thanks as always for watching. I appreciate that as always, and I'll be back again soon to discuss something else.